now that there are over 1,400 videos, I've realized it's a little hard to navigate, especially for people who are just starting off or they're just starting to review their mathematics and they want to know what playlist should they watch and in which order. So the most, and I'll focus on the mathematics, but maybe we'll branch off of that into the sciences a little bit. So the most basic mathematics playlist I have is the arithmetic playlist. Arithmetic playlist, and that covers literally everything starting with 1 plus 1 equals 2, and it goes through multiplying, adding, subtracting, dividing decimals, and doing those with multiple digit numbers. If you're already very familiar with that, you can skip the arithmetic playlist. After that, there is the pre-algebra playlist. Pre-algebra, and as the name implies, it kind of covers the basic things you need to know before you really embark on algebra, like adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing, negative numbers, adding and subtracting, multiplying and dividing, fractions, units, things like exponents, all of the things that you need before you really start to understand algebra. And if you know that, that's great. But I find for a lot of people who haven't been to school in a long time, this is usually a good place to start. Although even in arithmetic, some of the decimal review won't hurt. Now, once you have pre-algebra out of the way, either you watch that playlist, and as I say, it never hurts to re-review it. You might actually learn some things that you had never picked up when you had first learned it when you were in school. Then you're ready for the algebra playlist. And here it gets a little confusing because obviously there's so much need for algebra that I've done a lot of algebra content. But because there's so much algebra content on the site, I have several playlists that have the word algebra in it. It can get a little confusing. So a good kind of the core algebra playlist is the one that just is called algebra. And it starts literally at the most simple algebra problems, and it works all the way through algebra 2 types of problems. So this is your traditional algebra 1 and algebra 2 curriculums. So this is 1 and 2. So the playlist that just says algebra, that's kind of the core. When I just started off, I started with very basic algebra, and I kept working. Now, there's a couple of other playlists that I've done since then that are also algebra, and they have the word algebra in it, and they're kind of related to this. I would watch this one first because it goes in a nice progression. But related to this, if you want to see a lot of worked examples, you could watch the algebra 1 playlist. Algebra 1 playlist that I've done a lot more recently, and actually all of these videos are in HD. And these are actually 100 and something problems and or actually videos where I do worked examples, and I do it out of the ck12.org Algebra 1 open source textbook. So it really covers every concept that's in the California state standards. And so this is really great for review. So if you're already pretty familiar with algebra and you just want to make sure that you get some practice, watch this playlist. Maybe even pause it after you see the problem. Try to do the problem yourself. If you've watched this one, this will only be more practice for you. And along these lines, I have a couple of other playlists that are just kind of more worked examples for algebra. I have the California Standards Test, California Standards Test Algebra 1. And once again, this is literally example problems from the California Standards Algebra 1 exam. So this is, regardless of where you live, this is really good review for algebra. And then there's another California Standards. I'll just call it California Standards Algebra 2. Algebra 2. So all of these playlists, these kind of branch off of that core algebra playlist, and they're all a lot of worked examples. So if you feel like you know your algebra pretty well already and you just want to see a lot of examples, these are a good place to turn to. Now, after you get just the basic algebra out of the way, the next playlist I would start tackling, I would look at the geometry playlist. You could look at the geometry playlist. And you could even start to look at the geometry playlist once you start to go maybe halfway through the algebra playlist. Once you have the kind of the basics of algebra out of the way, you can start with the geometry playlist. And then after geometry, you can go into trigonometry. And then also after the algebra playlist, you really are ready for the pre-calculus playlist. So let me write that down. You are ready for the pre-calculus playlist, but I would at least familiarize yourself with the geometry and the trigonometry. So let me write pre-calculus here. Pre-calculus. Pre-calculus here. I think in most schools you take arithmetic, then pre-algebra, then you take algebra 1, then geometry, then algebra 2, which has a lot of review of algebra 1, and then you take trigonometry and pre-calculus, usually your junior year, your senior year is this is kind of the pre-calculus curriculum, and then you take calculus. So after you do all of this, then you're ready for the calculus playlist. Then you're ready for the calculus playlist. Let me do this in a new color. I'm running out. Let me do it in, I'll do it in that. Then you're ready for the calculus playlist. And this is a pretty extensive playlist. I think I'm pushing almost 200 videos here. And this really is the first 3 semesters. So you can kind of view it as calculus 1, 2, and 3. And I might actually have thought about breaking this up into multiple playlists. It does all of differential calculus, integral calculus, multivariable calculus, vector calculus. So this calculus playlist is quite extensive. And I might break it up. But once you're pretty far into the calculus playlist, you actually don't have to complete it. Once you start seeing me do things like partial derivatives and divergence and curl and all the vector calculus stuff, you can actually also branch off. You could also branch off into several other of the kind of advanced topic videos. You could branch off into differential equations. Differential equations, which is usually a sophomore level class in college, and also linear algebra. Linear algebra. And this is an important one to point out because someone says, hey, linear algebra, that sounds simpler than nonlinear algebra. Maybe that's a basic algebra course. No, this is quite advanced, mathematically rigorous type of kind of a mathy subject. But once you're reasonably far through calculus, you could even, if you have a strong, you might even be able to start the linear algebra after just doing a little bit of the pre-calculus or the algebra, but it's a little bit mathematically sophisticated, so you might want to hold off on that. Now, on top of that, if you look at kind of the sciences that we have on the Khan Academy, we also have physics. And you can really start the physics playlist as it is after you have a good proficiency on the algebra playlist. So after you've watched the algebra playlist, you can start watching physics. You can watch the physics playlist. And the chemistry playlist, you don't need a lot of algebra. It has a little bit of algebra in it. You could just watch the first part of the algebra playlist if you need to. But it's a good thing to get out of the way. So you can also, that's a good branching point for just the chemistry playlist. For the chemistry. And then the biology playlist doesn't have a lot of math in it. The only math that is there is a little bit of statistics and probability in the genetics. So I'd also at least get pre-algebra out of the way, but probably the algebra. Algebra's core to pretty much everything. Biology. And then the other math that we have on the side is statistics. And there too, I go at a slightly more advanced level than what you would normally see, kind of at a very basic statistics course. So there too, I would see this algebra as the branching point. So there too, algebra. So the algebra, the one that just has the word algebra on it, is kind of the core playlist, the core for pretty much everything else. And the playlists that say Algebra 1, California Standards Test, Algebra 1, Algebra 2, these are just worked examples. And then linear algebra is actually a quite advanced course. So if we look at the site itself, let me bring the site here. If we look at the site itself, just to make sure you understand all of the different playlists here. So these are SAT problems. I've worked through all of the problems in this book. I understand there's a new edition now, so I'll have to do some more problems. These are worked GMAT examples. This is the chemistry playlist that I told you about. That you should probably watch you don't have to watch the entire algebra playlist, but it's good to have a decent working understanding of algebra. Biology, linear algebra. This is the advanced playlist that I talked about. This is probably after at least you've watched the pre-calculus playlist, but even some calculus wouldn't hurt. This is the Algebra 1. This is worked examples from the ck12.org open source textbook. It's good for if you want to just get a lot of Algebra 1 examples. This is the core algebra playlist right here. It starts at very basic linear equations, and then it goes quite advanced into kind of a lot of Algebra 2 type concepts. These are more examples, California standards, and all of that. And then I won't go all of the playlist. I think that gave a pretty good overview. The last piece, I have some of these finance videos, and these are kind of, they jump around. Some of them you probably just need about pre-algebra level of understanding. Some of them you might want to have at least algebra under your belt. Some of them even venture a little bit into what I would consider pre-calculus. So these are a little bit more hodgepodge, and I might try to structure them a little bit. But most of them do not require too much math, especially things like venture capital and capital markets, the banking playlist. These require very little mathematics. And I think that pretty much covers everything. Oh, and I also have this playlist on California Standards Test geometry. So if we go back to this, we have our core geometry playlist, and for examples, we have the California Standards geometry playlist. So these are worked examples as well.